in societies which are democratic and in general libertarian societies. Societies where people are allowed to construct competitions in which a state allows them to function in society for as long as they forward a social good. In particular, this debate will be discussing the idea of an eating contest, where the state has allowed people to conglomerate in a group wherein individuals are fascinated with the ability to ingest large portions and consume food. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that in this debate the question is asked on whether or not this is something the state should allow, given large ramifications when it comes to individual health and individual well-being. We say inside affirmative that it's something we'd like to ban and like to disallow for the remainder of time. What are we going to be talking about in this speech? I'm going to be discussing 3 points of construction. First, on the function of the state and why this is a direct detriment to the ability of the state to fulfill its responsibilities. Second, I'm going to talk about inhibiting conscious moderation and how this forwards all the wrong values. And finally, I'm going to talk about the label of victory and why a competition is the worst field for us to forward this idea. First point. First, I'm going to illustrate the idea of state power and why inherently it's something that extends all the way to this aspect. For example, Mr. Speaker, establishments are not allowed to sell alcohol to individuals who they are certain to already be drunk or intoxicated. This means that for as long as the state could see it, and for as long as the state could see an individual in a position where he is vulnerable to mass consumption, the state stops it. Why don't we do this at home? Binge eating on your personal behalf or in your personal sphere is something we can't control, but if we could, we would. Because in that context, the first conclusion I want to draw out from this argument is that it doesn't matter whether you consent to it or not. Once the state recognizes that there's an absolute harm in terms of what you're doing, a harm that is not merited by any value in terms of something we could measure, the state stops you from doing it. First conclusion. Second conclusion I want to draw is the certainty of these harms, and we have to get a little bit scientific in this point of the debate. What am I talking about? The consumption of food in these contests are more likely than not coming from hot dogs, for example, from hamburgers, from things that are easy to produce and things that are marketable. In fact, these are things that could get sponsors. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that these kinds of food bring with them certain harms. What are these harms? We say that these harms come from, for example, liver disease when you take too much oil or too much fatty food. We're talking about cardiovascular harms when it talks about cholesterol, and when you talk about the inability of your veins and arteries for processing your bloodstream. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that the state recognizes these things, and the distinction is quite clear. We allow you to consume them in moderation when you could control how much you eat, or when the state sees that you could, for example, get a quick bite to eat. But the state never encourages you to take these in mass amounts. And there is precedence for this, that the state recognizes and controls the quantities of these kinds of things. For example, prescription drugs, even when prescribed, cannot be taken beyond the dosage as recommended by a doctor. We say that even junk food, Mr. Speaker, has been banned in certain places in the United States because the state recognizes that there are sheer harms from the ingestion of this food. But there's a third characterization, and that's these foods are very easy to get addicted to because these foods are very tasty, for example, or these foods contain chemicals which make it so easy for you to buy. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, it can also be that these foods are cheap, and because they're cheap, they're very easy to buy and they're very easy to come about access to. That means, Mr. Speaker, that the state has a moral and ethical duty to protect individuals from taking part of these programs because these programs and these competitions make it so easy for them to get trapped into this mess and to go into this spiral. This means, ladies and gentlemen, that it also taps into the training you go into these competitions. Because these aren't simple contests where you meet up in one day because on a whim. You actually train for these competitions, Mr. Speaker. You stop eating for 2 days beforehand, putting your body at sheer risk of damage, putting your body in harm's way just because you want to win this competition. The second conclusion I want to draw out is simple. In the face of certain harms, does the state have the responsibility or the leeway to give up on moderating or banning these acts when it's recognized that there are things in the way that are of sheer harm to people? We talked about bartender's discretion, we talked about regulating prescription medicines. There's been precedence for this. This is something that we should do, and that means that the function of the state goes hand in hand with stopping individuals from going to these eating contests. Second argument. Let's talk about inhibiting conscious moderation. And to this respect, Mr. Speaker, we want to talk about the principle and the philosophy behind food. People eat so they can live. It's not the other way around. We don't live to eat. And to that degree, it means that the social function of food is directly tied to health as well, where individuals actualize themselves in food not because of happiness, they actualize it because they get healthier from it, it's sustenance, Mr. Speaker. And to that degree, we say that's why we have the Food and Drug Administration, for example. That's why we have the Health Department. But why is it that it's diametrically opposed to having an eating contest? We say, Mr. Speaker, the first characterization and the first conclusion out of the second argument is this. Eating contests become a race to the bottom. A race to the bottom wherein you have to be the unhealthiest of the pack for you to win. You have to be the worst off, the individual with the worst health, the individual with the capacity to put himself in harm's way the most for you to win this contest. That means, Mr. Speaker, we have to analyze the ramifications of the message you send out of this position. We say, Mr. Speaker, we allow other sports because they carry with them, at best, values which society benefits by, and at worst, they're value neutral and don't create harms. Examples of this, for example, are the values of athletics when it comes to exercise and good health. We can also talk about the whims you get out of board games. At best, Mr. Speaker, society has a mass benefit out of what you encourage in the status quo, and at worst, it's a board game where individuals have a whim but they don't incur mass harms to their bodies. We say, Mr. Speaker, eating contests don't fall into either category. And to that degree, we say it's not something the state could encourage, and it's not something that the state should even allow in the status quo. Herein also asks the question of consent once again. We say, Mr. Speaker, we don't care. We don't care because a certain harm is in our path, and conglomerating into that first construction I gave in the first argument, it's also an acknowledged detriment to health. And when you acknowledge that detriment to health, Mr. Speaker, we say that even if we concede to a certain degree, you might feel happier, we have to weigh that happiness you gain against the detriment of health, not only to your person, but to everyone else you encourage to join that contest. Because we say, Mr. Speaker, for as long as these contests are alive, there's an active encouragement on other individuals to join these contests, especially when you're of the vulnerable category who wants to join them. What am I talking about? Individuals who can't, for example, be good at sports, who can't, for example, be smart at school, find other avenues for them to actualize themselves. We say that this is one of the most unhealthiest ways to do it. We say it's something that state should prevent. That's the first conclusion and the only conclusion of the second argument. But the last thing I want to bring about is the idea of victory, and it's a sub-argument to this. We say, Mr. Speaker, winning a competition means putting you in a pedestal, where you're in a position where society lauds you and applauds you for something great that you've done. We say that this is the analysis that we want to leave you with in the first speech. Winning a competition, Mr. Speaker, can never be a position where an individual could be trusted to act as a model for others to follow, when that model himself is in a position wherein people recognize him as in a position of detriment or in a position of harm. We don't want people to look up to individuals who win eating contests as role models because we don't want other people following their footsteps. Because it's not only about competition, food and eating is part of everyday life, and is the part I want to leave you with. We say, Mr. Speaker, it's unhealthy for you to imagine yourself in a position where you're going to go into this kind of diet, or where you're going to go into this kind of food, and where you're going to go through this in everyday life. And to that degree, we say, Mr. Speaker, in as much as the state could draw the line is as follows. We want you to be into this process in a moderate fashion, where you could control your intake. But anything that could damage that, or anything that could encourage you to believe otherwise, will bring you to harm. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, if it means banning eating contests at the expense of the millions who love hot dogs, it's something we wish to forward, it's something we wish to protect. Thanks.
Right, and invite Alex to open the case for Queensland, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the very beginning, the opposition has mischaracterized the role of the state in the lives of its private citizens. From the very get-go, within the first 30 seconds of his speech, he said, we allow people to do things as long as there's a social good that we can make sure accrues. That has never been the test for what states allow individuals to do. As long as they're a private good and there are not external harms to other individuals who have not consented to be involved in that activity or that transaction, then the state has an obligation to make sure that it allows people to do the activities that they want. Because at the end of the day, it's not for us to decide what individuals should value in their lives, it's for them to make that decision and for them to value that calculus themselves. Because they are the individuals who are best placed to decide what is good for them rather than the opposition. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the 3 points they brought us. Firstly, the function of the state, and then inhibiting moderation, and then victory. So first on to this idea of the function of the state from the very get-go. They said, there's a few tests that we use to moderate activity. We don't give more alcohol to drunks who are already intoxicated at premises and things like that. That is because there is a very clear and very present harm to the rest of society of having citizens who cannot, like blind drunk, wandering through the streets, possibly getting violent and hopping into motor vehicles and things like that. They gave us prescription medication. The difference between indulging in 20 hamburgers and downing a pack of like drugs is that in the former it's probably not great if you do it every day of your life from 30 years, but the latter will kill you instantly the very next day, ladies and gentlemen. And then they gave you one of the glorious, greatest mischaracterizations of who the individuals engaged in these activities are. They said it's a race to the bottom to see, who is the most unhealthiest. Absolute rubbish, Mr. Speaker. The individuals who do the best in eating competitions are those who have trained themselves. Why do you think it's so difficult to win these competitions? Because it's not simply who is willing to subject their body to the most harm, but who has actually trained their stomach and their internal organs to function in this way. And to do that, you have to be incredibly disciplined and manage both your eating very effectively. For instance, the US hot dog eating champion only weighs 72 kilograms. One of the most infamous food eating champions in the world is the Black Widow from Japan, who is approximately the same size as my second speaker, ladies and gentlemen. These are individuals who have managed to restrain their body in certain ways and understand moderation, and that only under very special circumstances should they indulge in these activities where they have trained themselves. Also, we just don't buy any of the analysis that these are harms that are intrinsic to food eating rather than sports in general. Marathon running has huge harms associated with it, where people go out running 50 Ks, every second day, ladies and gentlemen, where their knees are bust, their heart gives out at 42, ladies and gentlemen, because they are simply doing things that are unnatural. That is what sport is. It is testing the human body to the limits of endurance and trying to champion the ability of discipline, hard work, and mateship, ladies and gentlemen, because that's what sport's about. And all of these characteristics are embodied in food eating and are intrinsic to all sports, regardless of what the opposition said at the very start. Then they said that there was, so with that in mind, I'll be moving on to my own material. So I also want to talk about the right to self-ownership and what the function of the state is, and then I'll be talking about the benefits to the individual. So first I want to talk about the right to self-ownership. So as the opposition said, there is a calculus that we need to consider whether or not we want to ban a certain activity. But here are the actual two criteria that Western and liberal governments all around the world actually use. That is, are individuals able to consent to that activity, and are the harms associated with that activity or that transaction internalized to the consenting participants, or is it externalized to people who are not involved in that transaction? So why do we use these criteria as a test? Well, because life is a system of trade-offs, ladies and gentlemen, where you have to value risks and benefits and harms for yourself and decide what is best for you. Clearly a marathon runner has decided that the integrity of his kneecaps is not the #1 priority in life, and that winning the races is. Clearly the person who engages in, the National Football League in America and places like that has decided that, his IQ and frontal lobes probably aren't the most important thing in his life, because he's engaging and consenting in activities that are incredibly harmful to those parts of his bodies. But we allow them to do it because those individuals have decided for themselves that participating in these sorts of activities is what will give them the most fulfillment in life. And we as a government have an obligation to make sure that people are allowed to pursue happiness in whatever form it comes, even if the opposition doesn't really understand why people would enjoy this activity in the very first place. Because life is a system of normative value judgments, where individuals are the only people best placed to decide what they value in their own lives and what trade-offs they should make in the long term. Also, in the case of food and eating competitions, individuals are the best placed to mitigate the benefits around this. The reason why the world's best food eating champs aren't enormous and morbidly obese, and actually quite slim, is because if you're very fat, you can't fit that much food in you, because your own girth restricts the size of your stomach. That is why these individuals are the best placed to mitigate their own harms at the very start. As I said, the harms are already internalized. The fact that we allow people to drink and smoke is indicative of the fact that even if there are long-term health consequences, governments all around the world allow individuals to partake in these activities from the very start. And a blanket ban is fairly draconian and does not acknowledge the right to self-determination from the very get-go. And again, at the very start, we've got to decide, how is this different at all to individual private citizens doing it in their own home? The fact that the opposition said that we wouldn't allow it then, even when the benefits are like at least as comparable as alcohol and smoking, means that they need to explain to us what other activities they would include under such a ban if they're using the litmus test of like personal harm to the individual rather than that to society. And these individuals can consent because they moderate their eating all the time to make sure that they're prepared to win the competition in the very long term, ladies and gentlemen. So, with that in mind, I want to move on to my second point, which is what are the benefits to the actual individuals in this scenario? Because as you saw in the opposition speech, they simply believed that there were no benefits whatsoever. Well, clearly there are, otherwise thousands of people around the world wouldn't be engaging in these activities in the very first place. We see that under a number of levels. As the opposition identified, not everyone is capable of going out and, becoming a champion Olympic rower and things like that, because not everyone's bodies have that inclination or propensity. But the difference is, if you have a particular set of attributes that enable you to engage in an activity, the government should allow you to do it, especially when it has so many positive effects for the individuals. Because as the opposition pointed out so kindly to us, these individuals probably have had a hard time in other aspects of their lives. And giving them an activity where they can exceed, nigh excel, become the very best in, perhaps even get famous in their region or in the world in, is incredibly good and self-affirming for these individuals in the long term. Because we should always try and make sure that citizens have an opportunity to maximise the utility and opportunity in their own lives in the very long term. Because in the end, that's what we want to reinforce. We want to reinforce a culture where we allow individuals to decide what they want in their lives and not let the government dictate to them what they should or should not be engaged in the very long term. Because that comes to the very crux of this debate. Because in the end, there are so many weird and wacky sports out there, it is very difficult to find a single litmus test for all of them. But when you distill them all down to a key few points, the criteria and discussions that you're talking about are attributes that are universalizable to these activities like this, where you have discipline, as I've talked about, and hard work. And in the end, just because the opposition doesn't like extreme eating, doesn't mean it should be banned, because in the end, only those people are harmed, and even then, they consent to it. Thank you.
Alright, and I call upon Dwight to continue the case for Ateneo.
Being good at something and knowing that you are good at this something does not mean that you should be allowed to do this something. I may be good at killing people, I may be good at butchering my mother, but that doesn't mean that I should be allowed to kill people and butcher my own mother. I don't understand why I have to do that anyway. So the first thing I want to do here is talk about the standards of legislation, the legislations of banning that they set, and I'm going to talk about why these standards are essentially wrong in today's society. The first question I want to ask then is this. Should consent be a standard? Because negative side tells us that we allow all activities as long as we consent to it and as long as there is no external harm. The first thing we say is that not necessarily, because consent is not always the standard. There's a reason why, for instance, we have seatbelt laws, even if the harm is merely exclusively internal. Even if, in a car crash, it is only you who will suffer with the consequences of not wearing a seatbelt. There's a reason why we have a ban on drugs on most states, even in public spaces. Because what we have to understand is that with eating contests, the risk does not occur just before your training or during the contest, but it exists even after. This is something that they don't recognize. While it might be true that the winners of these hot dog eating contests are thin, we also have to analyze the risks that they take before, during, and after. So let's talk about this risk. Before this contest, for instance, you have to starve yourself for 2 days, and even 2 weeks before that, just so you can condition your own body. And during this own contest, you yourself will suffer the risks of any sorts of health abuses that will occur as a consequence of shoving too much hot dogs down your throat. And then even after that, you have to suffer the long-term consequences of eating excessive amounts, for instance, of hot dogs, of having excessive amounts of substances. In the most extreme of cases, this can lead to severe injury, even to death. What am I talking about? In 2010, they had a water drinking contest where the prize was a Nintendo Wii. There was a woman who actually joined that contest, and she ingested so much water that eventually she died 2 weeks after the competition. So even if you have these people who train and condition themselves, the harm doesn't mean that they will never experience the harms we are talking about. Because the harms we are talking about are actually assured because we are talking about processed, unhealthy food that is being taken in excessive amounts. But then what do they say? They say that it's not that different from marathon training, from marathon running. The first thing we'll say is there is a difference between how you condition yourself in marathon running and eating contests. Because in marathon running, you condition yourself to actually take in the massive harms of your body, for instance. So, if you train, eventually your knees can take it as muscle memory. But your stomach doesn't have muscle memory. No matter how many hamburgers you take, all the wasteful nutrients that are there just won't go away, and you still will experience, the harms of eating a sack of hamburgers each and every day, for instance. So eating contests should actually make you closer to being resistant to the risks of eating hamburgers. It actually puts you closer to cancer in the very first place. But secondly, they say that all of this is good because the harm is not external. What they miss essentially is Darren's analysis of why the harm is actually external. Because what does it mean to be win at something? What does it mean when media outlets celebrate you as someone who has actually enjoyed or has actually won a contest? It means that your achievement is something to be lauded, is something to be appreciated. It then forwards a culture of consumerism where it's okay to actually pursue excess. As they have said, where it's okay to actually join these eating contests and have a shot at being famous and at being successful, for instance, and hence have a shot at actually eating so much hamburgers that you are then much closer to cancer. But secondly, now we want to ask this. Is your ability to excel in something a criterion for legislation? No, because if I am good at killing, it doesn't mean that I should be allowed to kill. The point is, legislation always comes at the risk of harms. And even if you excel at something that might cause you harm, the state still wants you to protect you from this harm. Because ultimately, it recognizes that your consent might not take into account all external factors that you have to consider before you make the best decision. That's why the state is there to actually guide you towards these certain decisions and stay you away from decisions that are almost exclusively bad and almost exclusively have very real negative consequences. What I want to talk about, I want to respond to this idea further that there are no external harms in terms of hot dog eating contests. And what I want to say is that what you do is essentially glamorize a culture of excess. What I mean, the harm, Mr. Chair, exists not just for those people who actually join these eating contests, the trained masses that you're talking about, but also for those people who watch them, those who idolize them, and those people who actually remember these people and just want to be just like them. Because what we have to remember is that these eating contests are essentially public events. And these are public events that are held further on in public spaces like parks with the government, for instance. So we are talking about these eating contests and how they are televised in sports outlets, how they are covered by news programs, by Good Morning America, all of these shows. And we are talking about how the results of these eating contests are broadcast to millions and millions of people, if not billions. Furthermore, we say that these eating contests are always legitimized by public icons. You have the Guinness Book of World Records actually having a subsection devoted to achievements based on these eating contests. You have Mayor Bloomberg actually making speeches at these eating contests and making silly puns about hot dogs. These things tell you that even major institutions like the media and the state actively support these contests. What is so bad with this, really? What we argue is, you actually glamorize this culture of excess, where you actually promote something that you know is harmful if not taken in moderation. You send the message to the public that it's okay to binge on unhealthy food. That it is okay to actually make sure that your goal is to be the best hamburger eater in existence. And we think that this is something that is made even worse by the fact that it is legitimized in public by the media, by the state, and all other actors that are supposed to protect you from harmful decisions and are supposed to protect you from harmful substances. Eventually, what these kinds of eating contests are actually part of a consumerist culture that has driven many developed nations to obesity, particularly the United States. And what we say is that this is particularly harmful because you are pushing millions and millions of people into celebrating something that is ultimately not good for them. And these people are not trained to take these hot dogs, are not trained to take these hamburgers. What we say is that it is good in moderation, but what we are doing is push a culture where moderation is not the norm, and in fact is something that is simply not enough. We want to reject that because we think that it should be proper, that everything is taken in moderation. Further on, what we say is that what you are doing is to actually disproportionately affect the poor, who are the most likely to actually buy these products anyway. You send a message to them that it is okay to be unhealthy, that you can actually use this as a way out of your poverty by being famous, for instance, or by getting your sponsorship deals and all of these things. We don't think it's particularly good. We don't think that excess is something we should celebrate. And for this very reason, we're very proud to propose.
Right, and invites the reader to continue for Queensland too.
Sorry, just let me get my way out.
Take your time.
Mr. Speaker, if competitive eating genuinely was as scary and terrible as going on a massive killing rampage or butchering your mother, then maybe we would concede this entire debate and say, hells yeah, let's ban butchering mothers, right? Already banned. The problem is, what we're on to do on the negative team is actually live in the real world, where competitive eating, yes, involves like eating a lot of hot dogs, but does not come anywhere near the apocalyptic harms that the affirmative team seems to be enjoying asserting in today's debate. Two issues of rebuttal before talking about my substantive. Firstly, what is the role of government, and can food be for anything other than pure sustenance? Anyone who's ever had a steak and its deliciousness appreciates that yes, it can be about happiness and things that are not only about health. Secondly then, is this issue of external glamorization, and will offensively poor people suddenly decide to eat way more McDonald's because now it is super cool to do so? Firstly then, the role of government. What did we hear from the affirmative team? We heard firstly that people weren't able to consent, and consent is not the threshold, right? Never dealing with any of the benefits that Alex told you were very, very good reasons as to why individuals should be able to make that trade-off. It is a subjective decision, Mr. Speaker, whether or not you choose to value your health, or which I'm going to talk about is a dubious claim in the first place, right? Or if you want to value the immediate benefits of being really famous, feeling good about yourself, because these guys are taking away the thing that people who aren't good at sport or aren't particularly bright necessarily are able to do, right? Things like the happiness and the glory of being called the Black Widow and having everyone know your name and love you. We think those are things that individuals are able to choose to value. You offend them by saying that they are too stupid to make that calculus. We heard, look, seatbelt laws are a thing, and therefore we should be able to engage in paternalism to this extent. Two responses. Firstly, seatbelt laws are not universal. The United States doesn't have them, and we are happy to call that an act of paternalism that we don't necessarily support on this side of the house, right? We're happy for people to engage in drugs because we think they can make that call. But secondly, to the extent that we disagree with we do agree with seatbelt laws, we think they're trying to stop immediate death when you get crushed in a car accident, Mr. Speaker, not when you may or may not get liver disease and cholesterol problems down the line. Secondly then, we heard, look, it's not about consent, it's about the certainty of harm. So let's have a look at the harms that they wanted to talk about in today's debate. First, we heard these harms are inherent. Look at the situation where people can die from water drinking. I think if the Formula One could list one death, right, as the only thing that ever happened to them, that would be a freaking miracle, and they would be really, really happy. People drop dead during marathons all the time. People drop dead when they go abseiling, bungee jumping, a whole host of other sports, and unless these guys are willing to ban literally every single sport ever, because fun fact, football for instance gives you a series of mild concussions that pretty much guarantees that you will be brain damaged at the end of the season, Mr. Speaker. unless they're willing to ban those things, that calculus does not hold, and they have to admit that people are able to decide for themselves what they want to value. Secondly, right, they heard, oh look, muscles don't have muscle memory, so it's like really bad because people will like never be able to engage with it, right? That is just like lies about science. Your muscles, like your stomach is able to expand to accommodate these things, right? Like you have to be incredibly fit because otherwise the fat that surrounds your stomach actually makes it incredibly difficult for you to eat a lot of food. These people are precisely the people who are looking at cholesterol levels and looking at liver, like potential liver problems, right? Because these are the people that are making conscious decisions about their eating as opposed to just eating McDonald's for dinner absolutely every single night, which these guys are allowing you to do anyway. We heard, look, they might get addicted because it is tasty and cheap. We're not shoving these hot dogs with nicotine, right? Like food is not that addictive automatically, and when you are shoveling like 100 hot dogs, you are not savoring the tastiness of the hot dogs. You're trying to get them into you as quickly as possible. We don't think that argument flies. Finally, quickly, external glamorization. We heard that this was going to encourage people to eat in excess in general. 4 responses. Firstly, this is contingent on them proving to us that eating like competitions are bad. We don't think they are, therefore we don't care that it might incentivize other people to participate in eating competitions. Congratulations. Secondly, we think that not that many people will do it anyway. Why is that? Firstly, because it is incredibly hard. You need to, as Alex told you, undergo serious, vigorous training because otherwise you try to eat food and you throw up because you can't keep it down. It is a terrible experience. You are unlikely to try to repeat it. Secondly, it shows that eating in excess is excessive, right? Like it is a spectacle. People have to work so hard. And I think that shows that it is not something that you should do at home, but it is something that should be left to people who are working really hard to make it happen. Thirdly, the culture of excess exists already. We see already people eating McDonald's all the time. Eating competitions is not what is causing obesity. Like difficulties in accessing easy, like good, healthy food is what is causing obesity. The prevalence of McDonald's, which these guys keep, is what is causing obesity. We don't think like having a few people eating lots of hot dogs changes anything. 2 issues in substantive. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the massive communal and cultural benefits that eating competitions can provide. And secondly, I want to talk about creating a more accessible idea of athleticism. First, I wanted to say that societal benefits and the existence of role models was apparently the litmus test for when we allow people to do something. Alex told you that was bogus. I'm going to tell you why we meet that test, even if it were a real test. Firstly then, this issue of communal benefits. We think that competitive eating, because it is rare, because it is exciting and it's a spectacle, is able to bring people together in a really important way. Because what types of areas actually engage in eating competitions and facilitate eating competitions, right? These are often like small towns, often in America, like little diners in Texas, where they're really proud of their steak, little diners in New Orleans, where they're proud of po' boys, which is like a big sub thing, or places like Japan where they have like gyoza eating competitions, right? We think that this is really important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it allows communities to come together to celebrate their culture and like create a sense of community that flows on to all of the things of cooperation like that follows after that, right? To things like participating in school boards, to things like knowing your neighbour, helping them out. I think that's an important thing that you deprive people of. Secondly, we think that for a lot of these areas, they use it as a fundraiser. Small diners in Texas would be going bust, some of them, but for the fact that they are able to advertise themselves as, come here, eat our giant steak or eat our giant burger, and that is really important in terms of keeping local businesses developing, but also really important in terms of putting that town on the map, encouraging tourism, particularly when you then get things like documentaries or TV shows like Man vs. Food, right? Which then broadcasts that to everyone and means that not only are you getting these small diners getting added business, but also tourism to that area as a whole. You deprive small communities of a really important way of making money and making themselves known. Secondly, about creating a more accessible idea of athleticism. We think it's important here that eating contests are able to stretch the idea of sport that at the moment is about being super fit, about being really lean and muscular, which means that a lot of people are left out, are deprived of role models because they're never going to be that body type, right? How does this change things? It says that so long as you're disciplined and you're focused on self-training, you can achieve something. That can be something that is applauded. We think that is really important in terms of allowing people who are at the moment also facing a body image crisis as well as an obesity crisis to have someone to look forward to. Are these people all suddenly going to become competitive eaters? No, we don't think so, but we think it's important that they at least have someone you take that away.
Right, and I invite Alan to close the case for Ateneo.
I want to answer two fundamental questions in this debate to show to you that affirmative does indeed, that this policy should indeed stand. The first question is, do eating contests fall within the justified exercise of individual freedom? And secondly, do individuals stand to benefit when they engage in these contests or when they watch these contests or when they have these contests in their communities? To the first question, is it within individual freedom? What we heard a lot about coming from negative bench were several things. Firstly, they told us that right now, the only standards for when we ban something are when there is no consent and or when there are external harms.
Yeah.
We think, ladies and gentlemen, these are insufficient criteria because they exclude the notions of internal harm, which we believe the argumentation of negative conceded to implicit here. Why exactly is that? If the standard for banning truly were just consent and just the absence of external harms, then Neg shouldn't have argued that being an eating contestant is also healthy anyway. Why? By arguing that it can be healthy, they suggest on negative bench that internal harms are something that ought to be considered by the state when they ban something. So at this point, what we simply need to do is to show to you that eating contests tend to be unhealthy in order to show that we ought to ban them. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is when I want to appeal to common sense. Because the only way that they told us that it's healthy is that you learn how to control your stomach. Imagine this entire table filled with hot dogs. No matter how much I can control my stomach, I can't possibly control the kind of cholesterol that I'm going to ingest. The kind of cholesterol that's going to be clogging my arteries, and the kind of cholesterol that's going to give me a heart attack 20 years down the line. Because we don't understand the false dichotomy that negative wants to portray in this debate. They said that, well, if we don't have a seatbelt, it's an immediate harm, and that's why we should mitigate it. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't matter if it's an immediate harm or harm down the line, because it still means you're going to die because of an action which the state did not prevent. That's the harm, ladies and gentlemen, that we want to mitigate. That's the harm that we want to prevent in this particular debate. What the previous speaker said, ladies and gentlemen, is that a lot of people die anyway. There's Formula 1, there's boxing, there's extreme sports. You know, a lot of people die. Firstly, we think, ladies and gentlemen, the nature of these other sports is not to ingest harmful substances. So you can be Kobe Bryant without killing yourself at the age of 40, as opposed to that person who won a water drinking contest and who eventually died 2 weeks after. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the fundamental nature of what you're actually doing is different. Because when you're aspiring to be Kobe Bryant, you're aspiring to be fit, you're aspiring to be healthy. When you're aspiring to be the Black Widow, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that's not necessarily the case. But secondly, we contend, ladies and gentlemen, that the harms in all of these other sports are mitigated by the rules. For instance, you're less likely to have Alzheimer's and a bloody face in boxing because there are gloves. But the difference is, in an eating contest, the rule is to incur the harm. The rule is to eat as many cholesterol-filled hot dogs as humanly possible. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, that when the nature of that particular sport, or when that nature of that action is to actually incur that harm unmitigated, because obviously they won't be giving you cholesterol-free hot dogs because those probably don't exist, because those are processed foods, man. We think, ladies and gentlemen, if the rule is actually to put you in harm's way, we think, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't a particular sport that we want to condone. But let's play by the rules. Let's assume that this debate is only about consent and it's only about external harms. We proved that for you. Darrell's speech told us how this competition vitiates consent because of the addictive nature of the very substance and also the very addictive nature of this competition. And we even see Negative Bench conceding to this particular frame. Why? From the previous speaker, she said that people want to aspire to be like the Black Widow. Like it's something that people want. If they contend, ladies and gentlemen, that people will always aspire toward being like the Black Widow, then they're necessarily saying that competition is what's driving the mentality of these people. And we think that in this particular situation, that is what vitiates consent because they're thinking of the competition. They're thinking of being the Black Widow, even if it is something that is going to harm their health. We think, ladies and gentlemen, by their standard of consent, we think that this policy and that this competition is something that vitiates consent. But let's take a look at the second idea and the second criterion about the externality of harm. We already told you coming from Dwight's speech that that's not true. Because if I'm driving and I have no seatbelt and I bump into a lamppost, I'm the only person who dies, but the state tells me that I ought to wear a seatbelt because they don't want me to die when I bump into a lamppost. So we contend, ladies and gentlemen, that it's not just about externalized harms. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, even if it were about externalized harms, we already told you that the glamorized nature of the competition, that the drive to push people to become like that, is already the external harm in itself. And this is something that even the previous speaker conceded to. Why? Because she said, ladies and gentlemen, that the reason why these competitions are so important is because they make everybody want to eat that huge-ass burger. When everybody wants to eat that big burger, that is an external harm. Because you're telling everybody that it is perfectly okay to be obese. It is perfectly okay to have those 2 large steaks that's going to clog up your heart and give you a heart attack at the very end of the day. We think, ladies and gentlemen, their benefits are contingent on the existence of external harms. And that's why we believe, ladies and gentlemen, even by their criterion, we think that we already fulfill a standard for when the state ought to ban something. Moreover, they give all of these little tidbits about how we allow drinking, we allow smoking. But firstly, we think this glosses over the finer points of Darrell's analysis when he told you that everything ought to be taken in moderation. But this is where I have another quip about how internal harms ought to be prevented by the state. Let's take a hypothetical situation. Let's say that this room is entirely filled with marijuana, and the only way that I can go out is if I finish everything in this particular room. By the time that I finish everything, I'm probably dead, but we think that even if the harms are internal, because I'm the only person in this room, the state will still ban that action from happening, even if it is internal. We think, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't really matter whether somebody else will be killed or whether I will be killed. The role of the state, ladies and gentlemen, is to prevent that particular harm from happening. Let's take a look at the second question in this debate. Do individuals really stand to benefit? And what we heard coming from the first speaker of Negative Bench was a very broad generalization. He says that we want people to be happy. But the strange thing about this, ladies and gentlemen, is that he never really proved why eating in an eating contest is an exclusive means by which we ought to be happy. Because they said that we want to make athleticism accessible to everyone. Well, we have chess for that, ladies and gentlemen. But seriously speaking, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that even if we want people to be athletic in other ways, they don't necessarily have to do it in a way that will compromise their health. They can be a Sudoku champion, they can be a chess champion, they can be a brilliant mathematician. Math isn't really that hard if you work on it, trust me, I'm a math major. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that they can find other ways to fulfill themselves without putting them in harm's way. And all the proof of that is everybody else who doesn't engage in an eating contest but is still happy and is still fulfilled with this particular life. So we don't really understand what is exclusive benefit. And what even suggests that this argument is true, ladies and gentlemen, is a very broad generalization of the first negative speaker. He said that we can't really quantify happiness. What that means is that nobody can quantify happiness, and what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that anything can make anyone happy. It doesn't have to be an eating contest, it can be Sudoku for all I care. You can still be happy without putting yourself on the line. The last thing they said is that, well, it's a fundraiser, you can come and eat a giant burger, and that's why I told you earlier that this is how the harms are externalized. But secondly, if it's a matter of celebrating their culture, we think that it's massively offensive for them to say that the only way to celebrate your culture is to force people to become obese, is to force people to harm themselves. There are other ways to manifest your culture. Filipinos like eating, but we don't think that everybody should be gorging down on entire pigs. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that eating is good, but when it's not moderated, that's when it becomes a harmful thing. The nature of this competition is to ingest harmful substances, is to incur harm, and that's why we believe it ought to be banned. Thank you very much.
Right, and invite Anthony to close the case for Queensland too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I didn't know it was capable for my team to make so many concessions within 2 speeches that apparently managed to fly by Alex, Sarita, and myself in case prep. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, all the things that they want to tell us were not concessions. They were part of a multi-layered analysis of the test for governments to ban individuals from doing stuff. Because what you were presented with by the affirmative team was a very single-dimensional test of is something bad for people, therefore the government should ban it. What we told you was the test needed to be more complete. You needed to factor in the fact that something might be harmful, but if an individual is okay with that harm because of the benefits they get from it, they should be allowed to do it. See, smoking, drinking, sport, pretty much most things that individuals do in their lives, hell, driving in cars, Mr. Speaker. We told you that individuals, if they could consent to that, were fine. We told you that there had to be an external harm in order for the government to enter into that sort of circumstance. So we told you that if there was no external harm, if an individual could consent, and if there were internal benefits that that individual wanted to do, then of course that individual should be allowed to do that, and the affirmative team had no right to tell them otherwise. So, I want to ask 3 questions in this debate. First of all, does the state have a role here? That I think is obviously going to be a big issue in this debate. Second of all, what is the effect on individuals? Do they get harms that the opposition wanted to say actually occurred in this debate, or was our characterisation of the ways individuals chose to live their lives more an accurate depiction of that? And finally, what is the effect on society? Is there some sort of external social engineering effect that necessitated a ban or demonstrated why this is such an important practice that should be preserved? So first of all, does the state have a role? I want to look at this point on 2 broad general levels, Mr. Speaker. I want to first of all look at this idea of a harms test, that an internal or an external harm is the reason we would ban something, and second of all about concepts of consent. So first of all, harms. From the outset, and what pervaded the entire of the affirmative team's case was, if something harms that individual, the state had a role sometimes to step in and tell that individual that those harms were too overwhelming and that you couldn't engage in that. We can test that on a number of levels, and this wasn't a concession, this was an important, multiple reasons why you guys were wrong that were layered on top of each other to add up to why this ban shouldn't be put in place. So we told you that we contested whether or not individuals were made unhealthy by this activity. I want to get into more detail on that within my second target, but needless to say, we told you that there were ways individuals could make their own choices to mitigate those harms, to take care of their own well-being. But even if there were harms, Mr. Speaker, we told you that we don't care. We told you that if an individual was being harmed by an activity that they were choosing to engage in, that was fine. They wanted to tell us that that wasn't the case, and they gave us a couple of examples of that, because they told us that all things should be consumed in moderation. A couple of problems with that, Mr. Speaker. They told us that alcohol was an example of something that individuals should consume in moderation. Except when it comes to internal harms, like in terms of health effects, Mr. Speaker, you're doing a lot of damage to your body when you consume alcohol long before you become drunk enough for the bartender to cut you off. The reality is that the reason why we cut people off from alcohol is not because they have they only start damaging their bodies once they're drunk. We cut them off from drinking when they're drunk because they can no longer consent, because they're no longer in a rational state of mind. I'm going to deal with that a little bit later. But then they told us about things like prescription drugs. We told you that prescription drugs are an interesting example where we don't let individuals scarf down a whole bottle of pills for 2 reasons. One, because an individual doesn't really understand what prescription drugs do to them. They can't make an informed consent because they're not a doctor, right? So if you're a doctor and can make that distinction, then yeah, that's probably bad. We think pretty much everyone in society knows that junk food is bad for you, right? We don't think that that's a mystery that people are not aware of. So we think that individuals are capable of making an informed choice on that. But furthermore, we told you that prescription drugs have an immediate cause of death, right? One hot dog eating contest probably won't kill you. Yes, one person died in a water drinking contest, but we told you that hundreds of people died running marathons, but we don't ban that, Mr. Speaker. So we told you that internal harms were not the reason why these things were banned. Finally, on things like recreational drugs. We as a side were never really challenged on this until the third speak. What we would tell you on that is that with recreational drugs, if a drug could arguably be consented to and only had internal harms, we'd be okay with that. So if it was the opinion of the state that marijuana was not an addictive substance, we would be okay with individuals using that. But maybe something like heroin, which is incredibly addictive, probably should be banned because it can't be consented to. What did they tell us on consent? They told us that these substances were addictive because food is delicious. Couple of problems with that. These individuals are not addicted to food. How do we know that? Because between competitions, they are able to go months at a time without gorging themselves. It's not like they have an addiction, which means that they eat 40 hot dogs every day, Mr. Speaker, because that would kill them rather quickly. The reality is these people have enormous amounts of self-control because they can eat 40 hot dogs and then spend months exercising and trying to build up their metabolism so that they can digest the food very quickly while they're in the competition itself, and then months later they engage in the activity. That self-control and that restraint is a demonstration of the consent and the lack of addiction, and that's really important. They told us that they're trapped in like a vicious spiral of training, etc. We told you, first of all, they chose to enter that spiral like anyone who chooses to engage in any hobby. So when I spend 3 afternoons a week training for football, Mr. Speaker, that might be a vicious spiral in that all my friends play football and I spend lots of time doing debating because all my friends do debating, so I'm arguably trapped in those activities, but you don't stop me from doing it because I choose to engage in that and I enjoy it, Mr. Speaker. That's really important. Finally, they told us that individuals who are vulnerable are exploited by this. We would tell you, first of all, those are the individuals that this is most important to. So we told you that modern conceptions of athleticism that these guys wanted to push from affirmative, about like how you should play football or run marathons or do Sudoku, are inherently exclusive, because if you're not good at football or you're not good at Sudoku, you feel left out and you feel like you have no sense of self-worth. We told that these competitions are accessible and give people a chance to do something that they're good at. They told us the difference, that this was their important distinction. No, all those sports and stuff are different because those sports don't involve ingesting harmful substances. We didn't realise on the negative team that the only dangerous thing an individual could do would be to ingest harmful substances. We would say that driving really fast in a piece of metal in a Formula 1 race is dangerous. Jumping off a cliff in a bungee jump is dangerous. Getting concussed in a rugby game is dangerous. That's just as bad as ingesting harmful substances. Furthermore, if you look at something like sumo wrestling, where they're actively encouraged to eat lots of food in order to be competitive, that is a sport that does involve ingesting lots of harmful substance. So would you guys ban sumo wrestling? Very interesting question. Okay, very briefly, Mr. Speaker, although I've kind of touched on this, what is the effect on individuals in this debate? They told us that there were health effects, things like liver and cardiovascular disease. We told you can get liver and cardiovascular disease from just eating unhealthily on a less extreme but more regular basis. So to that extent, you're not mitigating that. We told you that things like advertising of junk food probably leads to that in society more than things like that. But furthermore, we would say that on things like, you know, sports are good and different in that sports involve athletic talent, so marathons you get muscle memory, blah blah blah, medical mumbo jumbo. A couple of things on that, Mr. Speaker. First of all, like the fact that the epithelial tissue in your stomach like stretches is, I did medical science by the way, is an indication, not an indication that the individual is necessarily being unhealthy on that. But furthermore, we would say that a concussion presents a more clear and present danger. We told you the individuals can train to mitigate these harms. Most of the, like we told you, the American hot dog eating champion is 72 kilograms. Why? Because between competitions, he's constantly on the treadmill trying to get his metabolism to be trained to be fast so he can digest things quickly. That's really important. He's probably healthier than me, to be honest. Like, that is really significant. But furthermore, we told you individuals can get happiness out of this. And that's really important, because an individual's decision on what makes them happy is important. What we heard from the third affirmative was people can find happiness in other ways. They can do things like Sudoku or whatever. A couple of problems with that. One, as I already said, what if you're not good at that? Then you're being left out and inherently excluded by the social contracts that they were pushing. But second of all, Mr. Speaker, what if you think Sudoku or debating or rugby or any other activity is boring, and the thing that you enjoy doing is eating lots in front of a crowd of people who cheer for you? That's an important benefit that individual should get. Briefly, on social effects. The only really kind of concrete argument we got out of this was this idea that glamorizes a culture of success. Of excess, sorry. A couple of problems with that. One, so does junk food advertising, you guys aren't getting rid of that. Two, there are plenty of cultures where eating contests don't exist, but being large and obese is glorified. So in plenty of Pacific islands like Samoa and Tonga, being fat is considered a sign of like greatness. Those cultures don't have eating contests, it still exists, we would say the causation just isn't there. But finally on this idea about it being celebrated, like Mayor Bloomberg with the hot dog eating contest in the park. We would say that, as Sarita told you in her speech, that demonstrates the cultural significance of these activities. For a New Yorker, the New York hot dog is an important icon of their city. To celebrate that in a public way and to get together and possibly raise money for a local charity while doing so has nothing but social benefits. We're very proud to oppose this motion.
Alright, and then invite the opposition reply.
Mr. Speaker, at the end of today's debate, we have an affirmative team who wanted to compare the potential of getting liver disease, something that I'm probably potentially going to get at this debating tournament, as a rallying cry, right, for why we needed to stop people from the excesses and the addiction of junk food, something they weren't going to fix anyway. And then we had a negative team who actually wanted to have a look at the types of people that engage in hot dog eating competitions, who recognise that you can't do this casually, that you need to train, and those are precisely the people that are able to make the best decisions about their own body and should be allowed to. Two issues in reply. Firstly, what are the benefits and harms to individuals, and who should get to pick where those things should fall? And secondly, what effects will this policy have on the community? Onto this first issue of individual freedoms. What we got overwhelmingly from the affirmative team came down to this. It doesn't matter what you think as an individual, because you can always play Sudoku. The objective test, right, is there an objective harm? And if so, the government has a right to intervene. What were the objective harms that we heard from them? We heard that you could get liver disease and cholesterol. We heard that you could get addicted to hot dogs, because people apparently get addicted to hot dogs all the time. We gave you a number of responses that went way further than that. What did we tell you? Firstly, we told you that even under their test, the harms that they were scared of were small. Liver disease and cholesterol problems are things that may or may not happen, and to the extent that they do, are things that individuals can mitigate against. We told you that these individuals are not stupid people who are addicted to hot dogs, but people who have to train all of the time and know exactly what they're eating, because that is the only way that you can succeed in competitive eating. We told you that these people were people who can go without food, who can very carefully monitor their bodies, and that was a decision that they were entitled to make. We told you that there were many other sports where these harms existed, and these guys weren't willing to ban them. They were willing to try to, argue that the aim of being Kobe Bryant was not to harm yourself, but the aim of competitive eating, unfortunately, was also never to become obese, right? That is not the same reason, and under their calculus, it didn't fly. Finally, though, we told you that individuals were able to consent to these sorts of situations. Why? Because when you're talking about the enjoyment and the way that individuals have to live their lives, health was never the only calculus. Alex told you that there are benefits like enjoyment, like self-fulfillment, like, as we told you, feeling like you belong somewhere in a culture where otherwise you might not. We said that these were subjective decisions that individuals should be able to make, given they were best placed to also know their own bodies. In a world, fundamentally, at the end of this issue, where there are different scenarios and different types of people, we told you that a blanket ban was never going to be good enough, and it wasn't the place of the government to say, well, just play Sudoku, ignore the fact that your happiness is massively diminished. Secondly, then, onto this question of what effects will this policy have on the community. We heard from the affirmative team that this was going to glamorize excessive eating, because victory and all of those things praise individuals and put them up as role models. We gave you a number of responses to that we didn't feel were effectively dealt with. We told you that it was contingent on us caring about people participating in competitive eating in the first place. We proved to you why competitive eating is good in terms of individual community benefits, and therefore we think that point is contingent. Secondly, though, we told you that not many people are going to be participating in these things anyway, because you have to undergo a lot of hard work and training, right? Because it shows that it's a spectacle and it's excessive, and it is something that people make an event out of. No response from these guys as to the spectacle nature of eating competitions. Finally, we told you that it doesn't fix the problem. Keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, to the extent that we are concerned about obesity, they do not ban McDonald's, they do not ban junk food advertising, they do not stop people from eating the same amount of hot dogs in their homes or over weeks and weeks and weeks. At the end of the day, we told you that this was important for local communities. They wanted to fall back on, it's bad, it's bad. At the end of the day, if you want to take the approach that eating competitions is like killing people, go for it. The affirmative team wins. If not, take the reasonable ground.
Right, and to end this debate, I invite Daryl.
I want to go back to the basic question of this debate. What platform, or principled platform at that, should we base the decision to allow or disallow eating contests on? Negative gave us this platform, the idea that consent is the ultimate arbiter, because an individual is the only one who could decide whether he's happy or not. We say, Mr. Speaker, that the problem with this platform is it assumes that consent is the ultimate value and you leave it at that. Because an individual's happiness is always going to be the pure and paramount premium when it comes to state action. We say, Mr. Speaker, the reason why that's incomplete is they never analyzed for us why consent is the ultimate decision and why consent is the ultimate arbiter. They only said that it was easy to do that and it was certain to do that, whilst in the midst of arguments coming from affirmative saying that there's scientific proof, that there's empirical proof, and there's measurable proof, that whatever decision they're making when they go into these eating contests are bad. We say on that ground, Mr. Speaker, the one difficulty they will find in winning this debate was that idea, that consent was a circular argument and consent became a circular platform that they forwarded their case on. And that's what led to further difficulties along the line. First thing I'm going to do is analyze the practical debate and why it was so convenient when they set up their contexts. They wanted it to be so that the regulated nature of the biggest eating contests in America would be the only nature that any other eating contest would follow. That the small town eating contests they have in Texas, for example, and Atlanta, would have the same regulations that they have in New York and in Japan. We see, Mr. Speaker, that that's awfully convenient in spite of the many incredibly convenient rebuttals they were forwarding in our side of the house. They said that you'll always drop dead when you run a marathon. They say that football will kill you and will decrease your frontal lobe capacity. We say, Mr. Speaker, that judging by these characterizations, it's awfully convenient for their arguments to fly, and they only fly in that context where you have those regulated ends. But further, Mr. Speaker, we say that they never really rebutted the idea of prescription drugs and the idea of regulation. They said that it's different in that respect because you don't understand what prescription drugs do. We could awfully say, Mr. Speaker, that the vitiated context that you're dealing with the idea of victory and with the idea of the addictive nature of these foods, could make hot dog eating contests just as incomprehensible to the common mind. We see that in that degree, they're not really addressing their burden. The idea that, even if there are these grand harms, you're willing to allow people to subject themselves to that bad decision. It ties back to the idea of consent I told you earlier. Even if you could consent to this process, and even if you are happy, you have to go back to the idea of what that happiness is done at the cost of. The cost of your health, the cost of external factors. They misunderstood the addiction argument, Mr. Speaker. They said that it was our job to fix junk food, and it was our job to fix the ideas of excessive eating in society. That isn't our job. Our job in this debate and our burden was to demonstrate to you why these hot dog eating contests contribute to that problem, and we've illustrated to you why that problem is immensely helped out in terms of resolution by removing these contests. It goes back to their very own example. And these individuals who don't fit in and feel that they actualize themselves through binge eating were to allow themselves to go into this avenue. It becomes so easy for them to eat, it becomes so easy for them to subject to themselves to these harms. It's not consent at all. And to that degree, we question, is it fair that we continue this practice in the status quo? Is it fair for us to allow these people to choose this option, even if we're awfully certain that these harms are available? We say to that degree, there is still no answer. But finally, let's look at this idea of safety, and this is the analysis we want to leave you with from affirmative side. They said that there's a way for you to consume hot dogs and other fatty foods in a safe manner. We agree, and we told you that it is through moderation, and only through moderation, that you could do that. So the question therein is, on which side of the house are you able to access that moderation? On the side of the house that glorifies the eating of hot dogs, not only for the contestant, but for everyone who wants to be that winner and for everyone who watches these games? Or is it on the side of the house, Mr. Speaker, where you make sure that that contest isn't there to begin with? We see that it's on the latter, and that's why we're very proud to stand behind this motion.
Alright, I thank all for your speeches, cross shake hands, and leave please.